You know, when we think about World War II, we usually picture these epic scenes of combat, right? The beaches of Normandy, dogfights in the sky, incredible acts of courage under fire. And all of that is absolutely true, and we should never forget it. But what if I told you that the single most decisive factor in winning the war in the Pacific wasn't a battle at all? What if the war was really won not by generals, but by engineers? Not on the beaches of Iwo Jima, but in the noisy, sprawling, muddy shipyards of California and Maryland. This is that story. It's the story of how a war was won by a different kind of weapon, overwhelming, brutal, and just relentless arithmetic.
Okay, so let's just dive right into that idea, because it really does change how you see the whole conflict. At its core, this is a story about two completely different ways of thinking. On one side, you had a strategy focused on a single glorious event, one decisive battle to end everything. But the other side, almost by accident, ended up focusing on building a system so huge, so powerful, and so unstoppable that it could take any punch, absorb any loss, and just keep coming. See, after Pearl Harbor, Japan was absolutely convinced they had dealt a knockout blow. They looked at America and saw a country that was soft, divided, and totally unprepared. And honestly, they weren't wrong. But what they failed to calculate was the massive difference between a country at peace and a country fully mobilized for a war of production. They catastrophically mistook potential for reality. To really get the scale of this mistake, you have to try and put yourself in the shoes of the Imperial Japanese High Command back in December 1941. I mean, these guys were the masters of the sea. They were fresh off one of the most successful surprise attacks in all of military history. Their confidence was just sky high. They truly believed they had a clear, proven, and frankly infallible doctrine that was going to bring them victory inside of a year. Now, this idea, Kantai Kessen, it wasn't just a strategy. It was practically a national obsession. You can think of it as a kind of cognitive trap. It was born from their defining moment as a world power, the Battle of Tsushima in 1905, where their navy just annihilated the entire Russian fleet. That victory was so complete, so perfect, it became the blueprint for everything. The whole Japanese Navy, the ships, the training, the philosophy, it was all engineered for one single purpose, to do it again. The plan was to lure the American fleet into one final, epic showdown, and in a single afternoon, sink it. In that mindset, a long, grinding war of attrition wasn't just a bad idea, it was literally unthinkable. America's industrial power didn't matter, because the war would be over before that industry could even get warmed up. And this right here, this shows you the fatal flaw in that thinking. I mean, just look at these numbers. Japanese intelligence saw an American economy just coming out of the Great Depression, full of strikes and political fights. They figured, at their absolute best, the U.S. could maybe build 2 million tons of merchant shipping a year. The reality? By 1943, American shipyards were launching over 19 million tons. That's not a rounding error. That's not an intelligence failure. That is a complete failure of imagination on a world historical scale. They were meticulously playing chess, planning 5 moves ahead for a brilliant checkmate, while their opponent was busy building 1,000 new queens. So, with a huge chunk of the Pacific Fleet burning at Pearl Harbor, what was America's first move? Well, it wasn't laying the keels of new battleships. That would take years. The real response was something far more immediate, far more desperate, and frankly, a stroke of genius born out of pure necessity. They turned to the maritime graveyards, the quiet, forgotten rivers where the ships of the last war had been sent to die. Can you just picture this scene? Hundreds of old, steel-hulled cargo ships and tankers from World War I just sitting in these long, silent rows in places like the James River in Virginia? This was the Ghost Fleet. For 20 years, they had just sat there, rotting. We're talking about ships with flooded engine rooms, with machinery so corroded it looked like a coral reef. There were weeds, even small trees growing on their decks. To the government, they were a bureaucratic headache, too expensive to scrap, but way too obsolete to ever use again. They were literally a forgotten monument to a past war. And then, the day after the attack, this directive lands. A simple sentence that set off an absolute hurricane of activity. Imagine thousands of workers descending on these quiet ship graveyards, the silence shattered by hammers and torches. They worked around the clock in the bitter cold of winter to literally resurrect these steel corpses. And within months, ships that had been dormant for 2 decades were chugging out to sea, their stacks belching smoke for the first time in a generation. They weren't pretty, they were slow, but they were tankers and transports and supply ships, the absolute lifeblood of a global war. The Ghost Fleet was the first crucial stopgap that kept the whole war effort from collapsing. But awakening the Ghost Fleet, that was just patching a bleeding wound. To actually win this war of arithmetic, you needed something else entirely. You needed a complete reinvention of the 5,000-year-old craft of building a ship. And this revolution was driven by two things: the organizational muscle of the U.S. Maritime Commission and the disruptive, almost heretical genius of a man who had built giant dams and roads but had never, not once, built a ship in his life, Henry J. Kaiser. Okay, let's talk about the star of this whole production, the Liberty ship. This was not a beautiful ship. It was designed to be brutally simple. It used old-fashioned but reliable steam engines because all the modern turbine factories were maxed out building engines for warships. Its hull had all these straight lines and sharp angles because those are way easier and faster to weld than elegant curves. But here's the critical insight. Every single one of its so-called flaws was actually its greatest strength. The entire ship was designed not for performance, but for production. It was designed to be built by people who, just weeks earlier, might have been farmers or housewives or kids fresh out of high school. And this is where Henry Kaiser changed the world. He looked at traditional shipbuilding, where you painstakingly build a ship from the keel up in one spot, and he just saw a massive inefficiency. He didn't see shipbuilding. He saw a manufacturing problem, so he deconstructed it. Imagine this. Instead of hundreds of workers swarming all over one hull, he had different teams all over the shipyard building huge, separate pieces at the same time. The double bottom is being built over here, the bow section is being built over there, and in a massive workshop a quarter-mile away, they're building the entire deckhouse, complete with plumbing, wiring, and bunks already installed. Then giant cranes would lift these multi-ton sections and just weld them into place like a giant Lego set. He wasn't building a ship. He was assembling a kit. It was manufacturing, not craftsmanship, and that right there made all the difference. So where do you find people to do this radical new kind of work? Well, you build a workforce from scratch. Kaiser knew he could never find enough master shipwrights, so he just changed the job. Instead of needing one person who knew how to build a whole ship, he needed 50 people who could each do one small task perfectly, over and over again. He trained thousands of welders, riveters, and electricians as specialists. And to find those people, he tapped into the greatest underutilized resource America had: its women and minority populations. Women, who had been completely shut out of heavy industry, ended up making up a quarter of his workforce. And to make it all possible, he built an entire ecosystem around them: housing, 24-hour childcare centers for working mothers, and even a revolutionary prepaid healthcare plan to keep them healthy and on the job. That plan, by the way, would eventually become Kaiser Permanente. He wasn't just building ships. He was building the system that supported the people who built the ships. So what were the results of this whole systemic revolution? The numbers that came out of these shipyards are, well, they're honestly hard to even comprehend today. They represent the moment that the abstract idea of American industrial might became a terrifying, undeniable reality on the high seas. This is the arithmetic that truly decided the war. I mean, look at this learning curve. It's breathtaking. The very first Liberty ship, the SS Patrick Henry, took a very respectable 244 days to build, about 8 months. By the middle of 1942, Kaiser's yards had slashed that to under 100 days. By the end of that same year, they were building an entire 440-foot-long ship from start to finish in less than 50 days. As a publicity stunt, they even built one ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, in just under 5 days. The system wasn't just working. It was like a living thing, learning and optimizing itself at a terrifying pace. And that incredible acceleration led to this number: 106. That's how many Liberty ships were completed in a single month, October 1943. That is more than 3 massive ocean-going vessels sliding down the ways into the water every single day. When reports of this level of production reached Tokyo, the high command simply couldn't believe them. They concluded the Americans had to be lying, counting ships that weren't even finished, that it was just propaganda. The truth was just too monstrous for them to accept. And this is the view from the other side, from the sharp end of the spear. This quote from a Japanese submarine commander's report, it just perfectly captures the psychological impact of this industrial flood. You have to remember, in 1942, these commanders were the undisputed hunters of the Pacific, sinking Allied ships almost at will. By late 1943, they had become the hunted. The convoys they were stalking were now huge, protected by swarms of destroyers and planes that seemed to come from absolutely nowhere. The ocean itself was changing. For every ship they managed to sink, 2 more seemed to pop up and take its place. The arithmetic was turning against them, right there in their periscopes.
So what was the ultimate military consequence of all this? It was battles like this one, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. known forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan finally got its Kantai-Kessen, its big decisive battle, but it was a complete nightmare for them. The U.S. fleet that met them was powered by this industrial miracle. And the result? Japan lost around 400 of its best carrier aircraft and pilots. The United States lost fewer than 30 planes in combat. It wasn't a battle, it was an industrial slaughter, carried out by well-trained pilots in superior aircraft launched from carriers that had been built in record time. It was the moment the dream of a decisive battle died, and the reality of a systemic defeat became undeniable.
But this incredible wartime mobilization, it didn't just vanish when the war ended. The systems, the innovations, and the profound social changes that were forged out of necessity created a legacy that is still with us today, in ways you might not even realize. This wasn't just a wartime story. It really was a blueprint for the modern world. Think about it. Kaiser's methods of prefabrication and modular assembly, that became the foundation of modern global manufacturing. The phone or computer you're watching this on right now, its parts were built in different factories in different countries and then brought together for final assembly. That is the Liberty Ship model. Kaiser's radical idea of providing prepaid healthcare to keep his workers healthy wasn't charity. It was ruthless pragmatism. A sick worker can't build a ship. That system evolved into Kaiser Permanente, one of the biggest healthcare providers in America. And the integration of millions of women and minorities into skilled industrial jobs was a social catalyst that, while it was far from perfect, fundamentally reshaped the American workforce and sped up the civil rights and women's rights movements.
I want to end on this quote from a senior Japanese officer because it's one of the most chilling summaries of this industrial reality you will ever read. It's a timeline of a dawning, unbearable horror. After the Marianas Turkey Shoot, he says they knew on a strategic level the war was lost. After the Americans returned to the Philippines, they knew the end was coming. It was just a matter of time. And after the battle for Okinawa, where the U.S. Navy assembled a fleet of nearly 1,500 ships, all he could do was pray for it to be over. The arithmetic had become absolute. And this brings us to a final and, I think, crucial question for today. This entire story is a powerful lesson about the astonishing power of untapped potential. It proves that a nation's true strength isn't what's visible in peacetime, but its hidden ability to organize, to innovate, and to mobilize its systems when the pressure is on. So it kind of forces us to ask, as we face the massive, complex challenges of our own time, climate change, pandemics, economic disruption, what is our ghost fleet? What are the rusting, forgotten assets, ideas, and human potentials that we're overlooking right now? What systemic power are we just leaving dormant, waiting for the right call to action?